I'm Peter Levine, the director of the Defense Management Institute, and we're here today as a part of a series of interviews of individuals who have made significant contributions to improving the management of the Department of Defense. Today, we're speaking with the Honorable Christine Fox, who served as the first Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation from 2009 to 2013, and as Acting Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2013 to 2014. Since her retirement from the department, Secretary Fox has held senior positions at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Throughout her career inside government and out, Christine has shown a rare capability as both a brilliant analyst and a strong leader. Christine, welcome. I'm
Thank
pleased to have you here. Christine, I like to start all of my interviews by asking people how they came to be engaged with the Department of Defense. You were probably the most famous embedded analyst ever on a Navy base. Can you tell us how that came about, how you came to be a CNA analyst?
Sure. So it's kind of simple. I grew up in the Northern Virginia area. I went to George Mason University. I majored in mathematics, and the local defense community went to George Mason when they were looking for young new recruits. And I was really fortunate that the math department put me up for one of those positions. It was a defense contractor, but from there I actually met people and worked my way over to the Center for Naval Analyses, where I discovered I just loved working with the operational forces. And so Center for Naval Analyses, like the Institute for Defense Analyses, is a federally funded research and development center. But their thing is they put analysts out with the operating forces, as you mentioned, and I had many of those opportunities.
And then how did you come from being um, just a good analyst to becoming the senior analyst of the Department of Defense? What's the pathway that takes you to a senior position in the department that way?
Yeah, so my pathway was through my work at CNA. I rose up through the ranks of CNA to ultimately become the head of the FFRDC, the president of the Center for Naval Analyses. In that capacity, I was also assigned to be the chief of naval operations senior analyst. We called them scientific advisors. And so I had known Admiral Mike Mullen for a very long time through all my work at CNA. And he was the CNO when I became the president and became his chief analyst. And so then he went over to be chairman. So I'm at CNA one day dealing with whatever people like that do when they're leading analytic organizations. And I got a call on my personal cell, came up as Mike Mullen, call you kind of take. And I took it and he said, Christine, come over and have lunch with me. I want to talk to you about coming into the department. So, of course, I did that. And that's when I learned he had talked to Secretary Bill Lynn at the time, Deputy Secretary, about my coming over to be the CAPE director. So that's how I got there.
Life on the inside of the Pentagon looks in many ways different from life on the outside of the Pentagon. What surprised you most about coming to work at a senior level in the department?
Yeah. So through I was at CNA for 27 years. So I had worked in and around the Pentagon, the Defense Department, and mostly the military side of it for a long time by that point. So I kind of thought I got it, right? But I'll never forget, as I was leaving CNA, some of my Navy colleagues and friends came up to me one day and said, so, Christine, all I'm going to say to you is OSD doesn't have a band. And at the time, I kind of thought, well, that's an odd thing to say. But boy, it made a lot more sense when I got over there because, a military department, they have a shared esprit de corps and a spirit. And OSD is a collection, as you well appreciate, of people that have come from different places that are politically appointed for a set period of time. You know it's temporary, and you're there to do some things and then leave. And that does not necessarily lead to that same esprit de corps. So what I learned pretty quickly is OSD is kind of a loose collaboration of very independently appointed people that report to the Secretary of Defense. And yes, he's the boss, but they each have their own presidential appointed, Senate confirmed relationships. That means they can do their boss's bidding exactly as he asked them to, or perhaps to follow their own path a bit more. And that was a shock to me. I figured when SecDef says do this, it's much more like when CNO says do this, or the chairman. And it was different. And I learned that.
So how do you manage through something like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think I think you have to realize that each person is there following something they want to accomplish. They want to do something. For me, I just believe in analysis. So I wanted to do analysis and kind of, if possible, even raise the influence of analysis in the department. But others had different goals. And so first I tried to understand each of their goals, their objectives, sort of what are they trying to accomplish. And then you have to look for common ground and build alliances.
I asked you what surprised you most about working in the department. If you were to take a different perspective, the public, the taxpayer, somebody who isn't familiar with the operations of government, what do you think would surprise them most about the way the department works from the inside?
I think people have a view of the Pentagon as this well-oiled machine, which is it is in many ways, right? It's an incredibly impressive body. When you get on the inside, there's a lot of sand in those gears, and I think people would be surprised just how hard it can be to make change, get things done. People refer to it sort of offhandedly at the bureaucracy, and there is a lot of bureaucracy. But really, it's about alignment and shared views and decision making. And I think people would be surprised just how hard it can be to bring so many people together and get something done. Because many, many times, I mean, once they agree and go, it's impressive and they get it done. I mean, there's just countless of accomplishments. Um, and so I think the perception is they're the go to, get it done. Almost going to DOD is the easy button, but inside it's not at all an easy button.
You served, if I have my count right, you served under three different secretaries of defense, Secretary Gates, Secretary Panetta, and Secretary Hagel. Can you talk about what you think it takes to make an effective Secretary of Defense? You've seen different examples. What are the characteristics?
So yeah, I did have the privilege to work for those three great people, and they could not have been more different, right? And Secretary Gates, consummate analyst. So as the department's chief analyst in a way, that was exciting, right? I had a lot of exciting opportunities to talk to Secretary Gates about analysis, and I share that they did not always go well. Lots of times they did, and that was a good day, but they didn't always. And then I go to Secretary, and Secretary Gates was also introverted, didn't love talking to the media. Um, Secretary Panetta, complete opposite, total extrovert, loved talking to everybody, and didn't really like the analysis. And so it was like, whew. And um, and Secretary Hagel was more extroverted, but he liked talking to all the foreign dignitaries, and that was his background, foreign policy. And he had great relationships globally, but a little different inside the building. So adapting to the styles was a challenge, quite frankly. But what I learned pretty quickly is that style is one thing, but what's behind it? And I learned from all three of them. First of all, they all want, in my experience, to know what objectively is the best course of action. What the analysis suggests is the best course of action. Doesn't mean they can necessarily do it, but they want to understand it. And if they believe it, each of those three people fought for it as hard as they could. And I mean, that was incredibly rewarding for me, and I admired them so much for that. And I think the other thing I would say that I learned from working for those three is the need for focus. They all had like a list. And some of Secretary Panetta, it was a list. He carried a yellow pad around with a list. And you started every staff meeting with the list. How are we doing on the list? And things would come and go at the bottom of the list, but the main list never changed while he was there unless he made progress and then could scratch it off. Big hard issues don't get scratched off very often, but he made progress. Secretary Gates had a different list, and it changes over time. For Secretary Gates, first it was win the wars, the MRAP, all of that, and then later it became efficiencies and tightening up on some of the acquisition programs. Secretary Hagel adopted sexual assault, and that was his passionate thing, and he really, and manpower issues, and he really worked those hard. So what I saw from each of them is that there's just so much to do. They all understood if you don't have the list, if you don't have a handful of things you want to get done, you'll get nothing done. And they did that, and they did it well, even though their styles were so very, very different.
Secretary Gates was at the department for 4 or 5 years. I can't.
I'm sorry, I don't remember. I think it was over four, like four and a half.
Somewhere in there. Since Secretary Gates left, we've had much more rapid turnover in the secretary position, which is something that we see in other positions in the department as well. And I was at
Yeah.
Personnel and Readiness for the last 10 months of the Obama administration. I determined when I arrived that if I stayed the full 10 months, I'd have an average tenure. So there had been
Yeah.
10 undersecretaries in 8 years. Can you talk about the importance, the impact turnovers in senior civilian positions, the importance of sort of staying the course and being there for a longer period of time?
Well, you can't make progress on the list if you're not there, right? I mean, Secretary Gates was there 4.5 years, so he, as I mentioned, got to have two lists. His first list was very operationally focused. His second list was more internally focused. He got a lot done on both. Secretary Panetta had a list and he got progress on everything, but he was only there for a year. And the Secretary Hagel also got some things going, but was also there for a shorter period of time. So I do think it matters to stay. I was CAPE director for 3.5 years, and my colleagues told me that that was twice as long as the average, right? So I don't think it's good to go into these positions with a hit and run kind of approach. It's just too hard. And the positions are the most senior positions of the building and the Pentagon. And so the problems are the hardest, right? Easy problems don't go up to the most senior people. The hard ones are there. And so if you're going to make progress, you've got to have some staying power. So I do think that turnover is bad. Now, some of it's not optional, like your time as PNR. I mean, what was the department to do, right? So, so when there's so much difficulty getting people confirmed, so much difficulty recruiting people to these jobs because the demands are so high and the things you have to give up to do them is frankly pretty demanding. It can be hard, but I do think the department pays a price.
Department of Defense is unique in the federal government in that it has not only civilian leaders but military leaders, and there are places where their responsibilities seem to be overlapping. There are places where they work together better, places where they don't work together as well. Can you talk about, and this has gotten a lot more attention in recent years because we've had two secretaries of defense who were
Yeah,
retired general officers.
right.
Can you talk about civil military relations in the department and your view of the appropriate relationship between the civilian and military leaders?
Yeah, I think it's a very tricky relationship, of course, which is why I think we've seen that it's difficult. It is civilian control of the military, and I think that's right in our country, and we can't forget that. At the same time, the civilians controlling the military should do so with hubris because what the military does, they're the ones putting their lives on the line, and they're the ones with the experience and understanding of how to fight and win the nation's wars. So it has to be a partnership. But you can't ever forget that it is civilian control of the military. So it has to be a partnership with that in mind. I think I saw that really well done with the three secretaries I worked for, starting, of course, with Secretary Gates. And Secretary Gates was tough stuff. I mean, he set the bounds of who the SecDef is and the civilian control of the military, and working through the hard issues and then being on the same page. And if you went off the reservation, you paid the price. And so that wasn't, in my opinion, bad. I thought actually it was good. But he was up to that point open and willing to listen, and he listened carefully. And he had nothing but respect and love, really, for the military. And you just saw him with the kids, the young military enlisted or officers. I mean, his just heart poured out to them. So it was a very close relationship, but one where the civilian role was quite clear. And I think the department did some hard things in those years under that kind of leadership. Secretary Panetta inspired loyalty a little bit differently. Now, if you crossed him, it was a bad day, but he really he wanted big Italian family dinners really to talk about things. But still, he was very clear, and so was Secretary Hagel. So in my time, the relationship was clear. I don't think there was as much of the turmoil that we've seen since I left. Um, since I left, I'm not in there anymore, so I don't know. I still do a lot of work with the Defense Department, and it does feel like it's gotten flipped a few times in sort of who's calling the shots on different policy matters or even acquisition. It can be a tough road. So it has to be a balanced partnership.
You also have a unique perspective, I think, from your CNA experience, where you were a close advisor to the CNO and the Navy. And my impression, at least I haven't worked in a military department, but is that the balance is somewhat different in a military department between the military and the civilians. And particularly, I would think in the Department of the Navy, where you have two senior military leaders who very much are the leaders of their services. Can you talk about the balance, the civil military balance, civilian military balance within a military department, and how that compares?
Yeah, actually, in my in it all comes down to the tone the civilian leader wants to take, right? So in my time, Secretary of the Navy was Secretary Mabus. And he had one or two issues that were really important to him, and then he kind of delegated the rest of the running of the Navy and Marine Corps to the military leadership. But those issues, I mean, those were his issues, and you really paid attention to those issues. I think other secretaries that I worked with were more in that collaborative mode that I was talking about. So I'm not sure, Peter, that I completely agree that it's different. It varies, just as it does for SecDef and the chairman. Those relationships vary. But I think the service secretaries right now, Secretary Kendall is the driving force for the Air Force. There's no question about that, for example. So I do think it's actually very similar.
Um, I mentioned at the outset that you were the first director of cost assessment and performance valuation in the department. That was a new position, but it built on an old position, the PA&E. Can you talk about the position of CAPE and what it does within the department? It's not something that I think that people outside the department would have any idea what a director of CAPE does.
Yeah. So So the role of CAPE inside the department is actually to help the deputy secretary and the secretary make the big budgetary decisions, whether it's a program or the budget as a whole, and make the trade-offs. It's an analytic position. It's independent. It's not, Cape should not have an axe to grind, should not have a kind of a thing they are pushing. They should not be advocates for anything. I know that that's a high bar and it's not always met, but that's the goal. And Kate should always be looking for facts and data and analysis. And the role of Kate within the department is to present those facts, that analysis, so that everybody can look at it. And then the deputy and the secretary can make informed decisions. That's the role.
Before CAPE, there was PA&E. The difference, first, the position became Senate confirmed. I believe it had been Senate confirmed at some times in the past, but it became Senate confirmed, and it was memorialized in statute, so it became a statutory position. And there's some who have had the concern that making it statutory in that way was a problem because it made CAPE perhaps beholden to Congress, which was not a good idea. Do you have views on that?
I do. Um, my own staff, when I got there, was terrified about that. I actually think so. First of all, it does make it harder, right? It does, when you have two bosses, right? You have the Secretary of Defense as a boss, and you have the Congress and the SASC in particular as a boss. You've got two bosses, and that can put the director of CAPE in a somewhat difficult position. But that's kind of true for all the political appointees in the department. The fact that CAPE has all the data that sometimes Congress wants to get their hands on, and the secretary might not want Congress to see it until they've worked through what to do with it, at least, that can put CAPE in a particularly difficult position. For me personally, I did not find it as difficult as I feared it would be. I admit that having arrived and getting called to testify on the Joint Strike Fighter program about 1 month after I got there, knowing absolutely nothing, and it was a very unpleasant hearing, that was not my favorite day. Okay, so that's not a fun part of being Senate confirmed. On the other hand, I think the opportunity to have a direct access. I mean, you were there, right? I would come over to see you once or twice a year with a little pile of analyses that I wanted to share. I hope my intent was to give you and therefore the rest of the SASC insight into some of the issues we were grappling with, how we were grappling with them, get your feedback before it was a crisis, bring that. I would able then to bring that back to the deputy secretary. And it could, if handled well, I think there's an opportunity by making Cape Senate confirmed to help build better relationships between Congress and the department.
Is there a risk that being called to testify on substantive programs could undermine the perception of CAPE's neutrality and independence?
Yes, there's a risk. I absolutely think there's a risk. And I think that it's something that everybody, the deputy and frankly the Congress, needs to appreciate that CAPE has to sort of work their way through that risk. CAPE has to stay objective and balanced. The department doesn't always make decisions based on that objective analysis. They can't always make decisions. Sometimes the objective analysis suggests something that's politically untenable or against administration direction or unaffordable. They can't do it. So if somebody that's got a different view gets a hold of the independent analysis, it can make it harder.
To what extent do you think the department can actually what's the role that analysis plays in decision making by senior leaders? I guess is a better way to ask it. Does analysis determine outcomes of decisions, or does it just set the playing field?
Yeah. So, sort of two answers. First of all, analysis is an input. It is not, CAPE does not make the decisions. CAPE provides the analysis to inform the decisions. I used to talk about it as helping the deputy and secretary appreciate their decision space. If you're grappling with a gnarly problem and you decide this, okay, it's not the optimal decision according to the analysis, but it's within the decision space. And here's what's going to happen as a result, or the pros and cons, or whatever to understand. But if you go way over here, oh, it's a bad day, right? So try to help them understand their trade-offs in that decision space. But it's an input. They are the decision makers, not CAPE. So I think that that's one part of it. You have to keep in mind that CAPE doesn't make the decisions. Um, but having said that, I do find that, so as an analyst, I mean, I'm with the Center for Naval Analyses. We prided ourselves in independent analysis, just as IDA does, independent analysis. We give the government the best answer that we can. And I thought, gosh, now I'm going to be on the inside and I'm not going to have perhaps that same freedom. And I was actually really worried about that going in. I never once had any of my bosses tell me what the answer should be. Not one time. They always wanted to know what the analysis came up independently.
I don't want to ask you about what's happened since you left, but I think that up through the time you left, I can ask you this fairly trends in terms of the quality of analysis and analysis input to decision making in the department over a period of years? Are we going in a good direction or a bad direction?
I think that so I believe that there's a lot of tendency across the department to use available tools because people don't know what else to do. And as the problems become more complicated, they knee jerk back to those tools. And it's not a secret that while I was there, I did a lot to stop the department's or try to stop the department's use of large campaign models because they were big black box tools. When I first got there, Cape was doing work with them, took the results to Secretary Gates, who basically lashed me in so many ways. I don't even want to remember that conversation. And I came back and I said, I don't like these models, and he doesn't like these models because you can't show a path from how you got the data to the answer. It's like, well, we put a whole lot of stuff in a model and we turn the crank and the model says, doesn't really help a decision maker understand their decision space. So but it's all they have. So taking it away, my failing was I did make some progress because Admiral Winnefeld and the vice chairman and his J8, they didn't like him either. Policy didn't like him either. So we got together and we stopped funding them. The services continued to use them, but we stopped using them. But we didn't come up with anything in its stead. And so as a result, what do you tell people to do? Well, think, use physics, use engineering, use math. Um, that's nice, but that's not a very helpful answer if you're the J8 and you're trying to assess a bazillion programs for the chief of your service that's pounding on you for answers tomorrow. It's just not helpful. And so I think for a while we were going in a bad direction. I think um, we still are not solved this problem. We turn to war games. I think in some ways they're better because they're more transparent, but in other ways they're worse because they're anecdotal. So I think that this whole issue of analysis in the department is a major struggle. I think CAPE does superb analysis. I was delighted, at least when I was there, I was delighted with the caliber of the analysts in the organization. They did not rely on these black box kinds of approaches. I thought they did really in-depth, well supported work, but they're unique in the Department of Defense. And so what are we going to give everybody else? And that's a challenge.
The model of analysis that you described is sort of a neutral party looking at the available data and then talking about the range of possible conclusions. Um, I would say it's not the only model of analysis in the department, and perhaps the more frequent model of analysis is um, somebody with a portfolio of programs, say, who starts with the answer that they want to have and asks the analyst to go find data to support it. And perhaps that one of the problems with black box models is that you have people who know what outcome they want, and so they feed it the data that they wanted to have or the assumptions that they need to get the answers that they want. So how do you guard against or balance that kind of analysis? Is that something that we just have to live with, or are there ways to address that issue?
Yeah. So um, I think, again, to probably overemphasize CAPE in our conversation, but I think that's a role CAPE needs to play. I think in through program review, CAPE works with all the services and the other parts of OSD in the department and understands the way people got the answers they bring to the table. And they can understand the flaws in the approach. And I actually found all of the deputies and secretaries I had the privilege to work for to have a really good spidey sense on this. You know, you've been hearing a senior leader say, we need this program, we need this program, we need this program. And then all of a sudden in comes this really beautiful analysis that says, oh, look, we need this program. You're really not fooled by that. They can tell when something has been objectively done. but it puts a big burden on those people. And so the more that we can make a requirement throughout the department for transparent analysis that's objectively done, the better. It's just hard. I mean, they all have a vested interest in getting to a particular answer and a lot of pressure on them to get to those answers. And it's too easy to use these tools to get that answer, as you said.
When you're focused on a specific problem, then you can come up with a range of solutions. A specific program, you can perhaps come up with a range of solutions. I always found the issue of readiness to be much harder than that because there isn't one point where you can say you're ready. There isn't one dimension of readiness. There are many, many different measures that measure different things and different types of approaches. I have to say that when I was on the Hill, my response to that, my reaction to that was to throw up my hands and say, um, I just have to listen to the chief and see whether he says we're ready or sees what he says are the shortfalls. Is there a better way to do that through analysis? Can we really get at readiness through analysis?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, I listening to a military leader talk about their services readiness situation isn't the worst thing, right? I mean, I those that they live that's what they know. So if you're ever going to just take subject matter expertise, it's not a bad place to take it in my experience. That said, I do think we can do better on readiness analysis, but again, it's hard. What I've seen when I've seen really excellent readiness analysis, and I have seen some, um, people have taken the time to work, analysts and operators together, to understand um, what you would call the critical elements of the ability to perform a mission. And this interestingly came out of Admiral Winnefeld when he was Lieutenant Winnefeld doing work in the Cold War in a major budget cut scenario. And they had no money to fly, and they had to get in just a month ready to deploy. And what he did is he figured out, if we can do these critical tasks, we can do anything. And he's just a brilliant guy, and he's a brilliant analyst just by nature. And he did that and then was able to tailor that 1 month of flying to get to that. And they won all of the competitions amongst the fighter community that year by doing that. And then that has set a path for the way naval aviation has looked at readiness for a long, long time. That's the kind of thing you can do in readiness. What are the critical tasks we have to be able to do, and where are we in our ability to do those? And similarly in maintenance, what are the critical maintenance elements that we need? It's really hard to figure out what those critical elements are. And that's where the analysis plus operators can focus. But again, it's difficult.
We have statutory requirements, the Government Performance and Results Act, GIPRA, and
Mhm.
the later one, GIPRAMA, which stands for something similar. I can't remember exactly what. But the premise is that in order to make government perform better, you need metrics, and you follow the metrics and systematically improve your performance by tracking metrics. Do you have a view as to the role that metrics play in the Department of Defense and to the extent to which we can improve DoD performance through the use of metrics?
Yeah, well, I'll cut to the chase. I'm very skeptical about it. The reason is that a- as an analyst, one of the first questions I often get starting a new problem is, what are your metrics? What metrics are you going to use? Well, if I already knew that, it wouldn't be a very interesting problem for analysis, right? If you know what metrics are going to determine good and bad, it's not an analytic problem, it's just tracking, right? I don't think we do the analysis to determine what are those driving factors, what are the critical components that you want to track in terms of metrics. So you just jump to metrics, you're just tracking stuff. You don't know if it's the right stuff, it's the most important stuff. What you really want to do is do analysis with data. You want to be data driven, but just calculating metrics becomes sort of an exercise that doesn't tell you a lot.
So I take it that you don't think that the uh, key elements of the department's mission are necessarily measurable with just a couple of numbers.
No, I don't.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Um, we talked a lot about CAPE. There's actually a statutory provision, or not a legislative provision, in one of the Defense Authorization Acts pending on Capitol Hill right now that would abolish CAPE. Can you just give your view as to
Yeah.
what the impact of that would be?
Well, okay. I personally, I think it would be devastating, and it's probably not a big surprise as having been Cape director and all of our conversation about Cape, but trying to be objective, I think that there really are no other places in the department where you get an opportunity to do balanced, objective, data-driven looks across programs, across issues in order to understand trade-offs. Everybody else comes to the table with their view, or it's a fight. My thing has to win. It's completely understandable. One budget, everybody has to get what they need to do their job from it, and there's not enough. Fact. Okay, fine. How do you make it all work? That requires trade-offs. If you didn't have CAPE, it would be the secretary and the deputy making those trade-offs off the top of their head, listening and deciding based on what who they believe the most, who makes the most sense, who pounds the table the loudest. I've seen all of those tactics work to some degree or another. CAPE's data analysis comes in and kind of levels those playing fields. Now, I had a lot of conversations when I was CAPE director with leaders of other countries, ministries of defense. How did you do this? Or other government agencies? How can we want a CAPE? How can we start a CAPE? And I got to tell you, if you took CAPE out of the Department of Defense, it would never start up again. I don't believe it could because the antibodies would just be so severe to not have it. And so losing it, it would be irreplaceable. And I think that would be a very big shame. I think the department would step back. I think acquisition programs would not be as strong. And I think that the secretaries would struggle to make these hard decisions without CAPE's help.
Um, you served at a time of highly constrained budgets.
I
I
did.
think the Budget Control Act was enacted and sequestration went into effect.
Yes.
You had the privilege of playing a
I
leading
did.
role in, I think, at least two rounds of major budget exercises to cut to uh, enact deep cuts in the department's budget. Can you talk about the process by which a secretary and his team go about putting together a package of 100 or 150 billion dollars in cuts, which seems like a kind of large amount of money to find?
It is. It was an incredibly large amount of money. So, so the process first. Again, in order to have any ability to do this well, we had to build a collaborative approach across all the stakeholders. So when Secretary Gates did it, it was hard because we didn't have the Budget Control Act yet. He's just prescient. He saw it coming and he was trying to get ahead of it. And so I had to convince all the undersecretaries in the military departments, my colleagues in OSD, that we really needed to take this seriously. The secretary wasn't going to let us off the hook. And, CAPE could just do it on their own, but that wouldn't be very well informed because we couldn't do it without the data, right? And so we did that. And so Secretary Gates and me and then my team, we had several conversations about sort of his big ticket items because he always came in with a hard drill with his views of what he wanted to look at. So we had those. And then there were general goals that we worked with everybody else. There is absolutely no way I could have done that efficiency review without his personal involvement. Everybody knew he was personally engaged, which made us really very unpopular, even more so than normal for CAPE, but that's okay because they knew that it was going to him and he was going to treat it seriously and he was going to make decisions. So they had a chance to bring data to the table and try to influence those decisions or not. So it has to be as much as possible collaborative. And then my responsibility was make sure back to them it was as transparent as possible. And they saw everything we told the secretary, and there were no games played or backdoor deals. Skimmer was different. We were already there. Secretary Panetta had already put a stake in the ground and said it was devastating. And in comes Secretary Hagel, and sort of like the rest of the country, he hears 10%. How can that be devastating? I don't understand. And of course, 10% is not. It's misleading, as you appreciate, because so much of it is tied up. It's really 10% of a very small amount of discretionary money. So we put together the strategic competitive studies review, or that's not quite right, but anyway, skimmer
Choices and
management review.
choices management review.
Thank you very much. Yes, how could I forget? So yeah, it was a very big lift. We again put together a collaborative team. I had representatives from across the department, and it was a small core team that worked directly in this case for Secretary Carter, who was deputy at the time. He was 100% supportive, and everybody knew again that he was the man that was leading it, but also it was going to go to Secretary Hagel for decisions. But in that case, we had the opportunity to do two things: find the money, which we had to do, and everybody knew we had to do it, and then also paint the picture, because people in those days were still laughing. They were still saying, "Oh, DOD, devastating. Are you kidding me? It's 10%." Of course, they can do that, right? So we had to make absolutely clear why this was devastating. And so I was very pleased with that, because the team, the core team, came up with the killer chart, right, which showed why it was so devastating. In one chart, it showed that it was sudden, and so much of the money was locked up. Basically, that one chart showed that the money had nowhere else to come from but readiness, and that and we were able to show it so that anybody could look at it. In fact, Senator Inhofe made a little laminated card of the killer chart and carried it around, which was I was proud of that, because at least it started to turn the conversation. And then when I went back as acting deputy, just my own efficiency review, I led one as acting deputy where we actually submitted to Congress two programs, one at the level required, one at the president's budget level, but one at the BCA level. But we showed exactly in plain English, and this is what we have to do to make this work. And it's, again, it started the tide to change in terms of the conversation.
You talked about how you had to put together a team and bring the services and the different communities into the tent with you to work on it. Did the secretaries you worked for set targets for each of them so that they had an expectation you're going to come up with your share and you're going to come up with your share? Is that
It was more general. It was more the military departments need to cut by X%, those kinds of things, which they hated because those were, in their mind, arbitrary metrics that were set independent of the situation of each of the services or the history of the budget cycle for each of the services or whatever. So they were more blanket goals. But I did have the flexibility to say to the secretary, we found what you said, but we could also do this a little bit differently or whatever.
as somebody who received those documents when they
Mhm.
came up, um, they were in many ways a mixed bag with some things that were very concrete. You can say this is a program that's terminating, and then some things that seem much more amorphous, where we're going to take all these good government actions and they're going to result in this amount of savings,
Magic savings.
magic savings. Um,
Fair point.
I assume that there's no choice but to do that. Was there game playing involved in it? Do you think, or was this a genuine belief that this money was going to be available and was going to come from these changes?
So anytime that we had a bullet like that in the brief that went to you and to Congress, there was some CAPE analysis that said whether or not they thought that, looking at budget history, that was a conceivable thing to do. And then Secretary Gates actually did require follow up to track it and see if those savings were being realized. But yes, of course, it it's one of the things we haven't touched on yet. But everything we're talking about, it comes back down to trust. And trust is, when it exists in the department, it's magic, and decisions are made quickly and things just go beautifully. But it exists all too infrequently within the department and then between the department and Congress. And this is a case where we trusted those statements. We saw that they were feasible analytically, but there were actions that had to happen. So I would say Secretary Gates took a trust but verify view, but then he left.
You correctly, I think, mentioned the role of trust with Congress on this too. Um, these different these different cuts had different levels of effectiveness or levels of support in Congress when they came forward. It's it's traditionally Congress is traditionally highly resistant to cuts in weapons programs. It's highly resistant to any cuts in physical facilities or personnel benefits. How did that play out, and how were you able to manage cuts around a resistant Congress?
So I would tell you that I don't think we did very well, and I think that's again why readiness took so much of the pain. You could argue, and I would argue, that the department still today has not fully recovered from the BCA hit against readiness. And I think it is because it's so hard to cut programs. I mean, even in the BCA years, you couldn't cut programs like the A-10. It just got everybody's, and you know how that goes. Doesn't mean you don't try.
I saw it firsthand, but interestingly, I would have said, looking at it, that Secretary Gates was the most successful in doing that. Um, do you have a view as to why that might have been the case?
Yes. So first of all, that was his list, right? He had his programs. He did a review before I got there. It ended right before I got there. He did a review of the whole program, and he targeted these 10 things, and he was going to get them done. And he just took them one at a time. And CAPE analysis was very, very key to those. Um, his ability to do that was frankly just, I would accredit it to his leadership. He was fierce. I mean, he simply would not back down. And so people could tell him no and he'd go forward and he'd just argue, he'd testify. He was tough stuff, and he had facts and figures. He had a photographic memory, so people would challenge him, and he'd just rattle off the analysis. I'd be looking it up, and he'd be rattling it off from memory. Um, so I think his sheer determination had a lot to do with his ability to do that, and he kept score. It's like check next one, and we just moved down the list.
A couple of months ago, you testified before the PPBE Commission, the Congressional Commission on Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, the Department of Defense's resourcing system. And you talked about the strengths and weaknesses of the DoD system. Um, we hear a lot about the problems with the PPBE system. Can you talk about what some of the strengths of that system are?
Yeah, certainly. I actually think the system is pretty strong. I I So I believe the strengths are in the category of giving the department's leadership the opportunity together to look at these key issues. And um, that happens when we review the service POMS inputs, but it also happens through the issue paper process. Now, the issue paper can be a hard process to love because anybody and his brother can write an issue paper and then it goes to CAPE and they get stacks and they have to look at them all, and that's clearly not the goal. But when it's right, and I did have a few years where I got Secretary Lynn and Secretary Carter to help me um, make them more focused on big issues. The the department leadership through PPB has a chance to look at things that are not in any service palm. They just fall through the crack. It's in the seams, or it cuts across, or it's small dollars. That's another thing that I think is really important. And as we think about the need for the department, for example, to be more innovative, an awful lot of the investments in innovation that's needed now are small dollars. And so they don't get the attention of the senior leaders because they basically only have time for the big muscle movements of the budget. Those are the big programs. So you miss the opportunity to say, oh, wait, no, look, this small investment could make a big difference. Or this cut in this small program, even though it's small, it has a long tail and it could make a big difference. So the PPBE process, that's one thing I think is a real strength, is that it brings the department leadership together to look at issues together, not in the silos of the department. They have to make trade-offs. I liked that. I liked that part of my job where I ran the 3 stars leading up to these bigger meetings. And every time I could get the services to trade off, to see that, really, don't you think you're being just a little bit unreasonable there? And everybody's looking at them, okay, okay, and they come together in a collaborative way. It's the only place that happens, and it's the only chance we have to be a joint force. When we were going through BCA, it was critically important. If we had the best conversations as a team talking about, okay, we're all in this together. How are we going to do this? How are we going to manage through? I think if we didn't have PPBE process, I don't know where those conversations would have happened. They would have all been in silos and then been arguments.
Congress is often accused of micromanaging the budget, but that's not what I'm going to ask you about. um, we potentially have the same problem in DoD with centralization of decisions and too many decisions. Are we at the right place in terms of what's centralized and what's delegated in the resourcing process?
Well, so first of all, of course, the answer is no. I think that there's a lot that could be done. The thing I told the PPBE Commission and that comes to mind with this question, Peter, is PPBE is a process, and processes don't make decisions, people do. And the reason that the process gets a lot of hate and discontent is not because it's an unwieldy and cumbersome process, in my opinion, as much as because it makes clear that we are not aligned. And so when you want to make hard decisions, there's too many differing viewpoints and it's hard to get there. If you're not aligned, it's hard to delegate down. It's hard to empower people. So the goal always should be alignment and transparency and trust, and then you can push things down, and that would be great. It's hard to achieve, but that's the goal.
It's a widely held view these days, I think, that if you built more flexibility in the PPBE system, you get more innovation.
Mhm.
Um, you mentioned PPBE is a process.
Mhm.
There are processes and their outcomes. Processes don't necessarily dictate outcomes. Um, do you think, to the extent that, I don't know whether you agree that we have too little innovation in the department, but to the
I
extent
do
that you
agree.
do agree with that, is that a process problem or is that a priority problem?
I believe it's a priority problem. But I also want to be very sympathetic to the people that are making the decisions about those priorities. And I call it here to there. So what I see in the department when I was there and certainly today is it's a tough world out there. And the demands for for military forces of all flavors are insatiable. And so if you're in the Pentagon and you're a service chief or on the staff of a service chief, you're just running like crazy to just keep up with the demands. Readiness is still broken. They can't get ships out of shipyards. They're having trouble with the depots. Everything is here, 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 now, now, now. And then somebody comes along like me, say, and says, "Hey, what are you doing about artificial intelligence?" They look at you and say, I'm sorry, I'm over here trying to meet this combatant commander's demands. So talk to me tomorrow." It's it's unreasonable in a way to expect them to just be going gangbusters on innovation where when they're struggling so hard to just make the very capable force we have today stretch so thin meet all the demands. So I don't think that's anything to do with PPBE. That's to do with the pressures we're putting on our Defense Department and our military. So how do you get out of that? I don't have magic answers, but I've certainly been thinking a lot about it. And I think we need to help our leaders see clearly what tomorrow could look like with a few small investments. And they don't have to be big investments. Innovation doesn't have to be a lot of money. And then it can be sort of like, okay, we'll do that and we'll try that. And then they can go back to grappling with the world that they live in. Because I think they all know that we need to innovate more. And I think everybody I talk to wants to be more innovative and is afraid that China is going to out-innovate us. Um, but but we need to help them along that path, and I am not convinced that that is something PPBE as a process is either responsible for or can enable. It's helping them in different ways.
I asked you about a House provision in the NDAA, so I'll ask you about a Senate one now. The Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act this year has a provision that would restore the position of Chief Management Officer to the department. You served in senior positions in the department when we first established the Deputy Chief Management Officer, and so you saw that firsthand. What do you see as advantages or disadvantages to having a senior management official, designated senior management official? Do you think that's an effective organizational tool for the department or not?
Yeah. Interestingly, when I was CAPE director, Secretary Gates, we started this thing called strategic portfolio reviews, and one of his was this issue: how should we better manage how should we do efficiency of drills in the future, and follow up, right? And so the option, we did the decision-based thing, right? So we didn't make a recommendation. It's like, these are options. And then one option was the option of the chief management officer, and the other option was two deputies. And then the third option was just keep piling it on the existing deputy and hope. Um, and so none of them are attractive, to be honest with you. And I think the chief management officer approach, I'm afraid to say, is probably had the most cons and the fewest pros of our analysis. You really management, from having done efficiency initiatives, right? You really quickly get crossed with the leadership of the military departments or the military services. You're like telling them how to run their bases. You're telling them how to run their personnel. I mean, what do you know, right? So you're going to be at war all the time. You're not the secretary or the deputy. You're the number three. Why did I listen to you, right? And I think that's the experience of it. Now I looked at some of the commentary on the I think it was a Defense Business Board study that got rid of or recommended getting rid of it last time, and the commentary going along with the new provision. And it's basically, well, it the position wasn't effective because the leadership didn't support it. And yes, that is true. Um, is the leadership going to support it now? And what does supporting it mean, right? I mean, I had the support of the secretary as the CAPE director, but that's not a very visible support. People knew that I was in the room when he made decisions. CAPE analysis was in the room that was enough, right? Is the CMO analysis going to be in the room? And what decisions is the secretary going to make that affects those things compared to a service chief? I don't think it's going to rise to that level. And until it does, I don't think the poor CMO is just going to be swimming in a tide of antibodies and having a lot of trouble having impact. That's my fear.
So this has been great. I really appreciate your taking the time to talk through all this. Let me conclude with one final question for you. So if you were giving advice to individuals who are coming into the department in senior positions today, or say in a year or so in the beginning of the next administration, what are the most important things you'd tell them?
Yeah. So, so I came in to the department without having worked in a political campaign. So I came from the Center for Naval Analyses, and I was there a while, and now I work with the department. But I just want to caveat my answer by saying I did not go into the department with the aspiration. I had this privilege of being acting deputy secretary, but it wasn't my aspiration. Okay, so if you go into the department aspiring to have sort of the opportunity to rise up in the political sphere, this advice is probably bad. But my advice is you should go into the department with some things you want to do. You need to love that department and love this country and understand it isn't going to be easy. But go in there and do everything you know how to do and can do to achieve those goals. And not worry about whether you're taking risks or who you're angering or maybe somebody yelled at you today, because it's going to happen. You just kind of go in understanding everybody there is trying to make a difference and you're trying to make a difference. So do everything you can to make that difference. And don't worry very much about how it looks or who yelled at you or are you in trouble or has this affected your next opportunity. Try to push those worries and thoughts aside, and I think you'll be successful.
Thank you, Christine. That was wonderful.
My pleasure.